And right now, Job is left in a place where he cannot explain God, but he also can't leave him. So when your understanding of God no longer explains your reality, do you retreat into what feels safe, or do you wrestle honestly with him? All right, well, we're going to go ahead and jump into Job chapter 10 tonight. Let's see. So, in terms of where we left off last week, Job had just responded to Bildad in chapter 9. And remember, we talked about how in chapter 9 basically was this culmination of, well, we're still waiting on Zophar's speech, but so far Eliphaz and Bildad have spoken to Job and kind of presented their case. And what Job is essentially saying in chapter 9, he says, even if what you're saying is true, then that means that nobody, according to our own righteousness, can present ourselves to God. So he says, what we need then is a mediator to lay his hand on us both, is what he said to Bildad. So essentially, in chapter 9, Job was vocalizing as the representative voice for all of humanity that we all need a mediator, because none of us can present our own righteousness before the one who is righteous, and that is God. So up to this point, Job has been engaged in a kind of back and forth between his friends. And in earlier chapters, we have one friend would speak and then Job would respond. And he would be like correcting what they're saying and also pushing back on what they're saying. But the issue here that we're facing is, as the story progresses, is that it's no longer the question of, am I right or are my friends right? But the issue now is becoming, how do I even exist before God at all? So here, Job is moving from argument now to exposure. This is kind of a crisis moment for Job, because he says, even it doesn't matter who's right or wrong in this case, that means that nobody can stand before God if this is the case. So how do we stand before him? And I think this is the deeper crisis, because Job has already established God's sovereignty first and foremost, that God is just, and that God is beyond human reasoning. So now the problem is no longer that he's defending his own innocence. The problem now is that he says that even if I am innocent, how do I stand before God like this in this current state? So in chapter 10 now, sorry, go ahead.
How do I stand before God in the current state? Meaning the physical malady or his emotional stress over what's happening, his emotional complaints.
Sure, this would actually be the spiritual state. Mm-hmm. So in his, he's not even looking at his, in terms of the physical circumstances or his emotional state of being. Rather, he's looking at the spiritual state and saying,
I'm the slow lit.
Correct, yeah. So this is kind of bringing a moment of crisis for him. And that he's saying that it doesn't matter physical, emotional, whatever it may be. The reality is, from the spiritual, the most important aspect is our spiritual state. And our spiritual state cannot even rightly stand before the one who is righteous. This is kind of the crisis moment that he's facing. So after he speaks to Bildad, now he's once again addressing his speech to God. So remember when we talked about last time, is that all of the friends, they're willing to talk about God all day long, but Job is the only one through intimacy who directs his speech to God. This is the difference between those who understand God through religion and those who understand God through intimacy. So that's exactly what he does. In verses 1 through 3, he opens up by saying, my soul loathes my life. I will freely give my complaint, and I will speak in the bitterness of my soul. Here he's speaking to God. So Job is no longer filtering his words, just like he did in the earlier chapter, but here he speaks directly to God, and he's saying, do not condemn me, Lord, and why do you contend against me? So the language here almost feels pretty accusatory, right? But it's actually relational. Because it's not rebellion, but rather what Job is presenting here in this moment is relational honesty. If we trust the other person enough in a relationship, then we should be able to trust that we can bring the truth about our heart and the way we're feeling to that person. Job knows that God can handle his brokenness. And this is why, even though, to other people it may seem like it's almost irreverent, but for him, he's crying out to the only one who he knows can hear him and who is listening, even in the silence. So here Job is not walking away, nor is he rejecting or even denying God. Rather, he's doing something deeper in which he's bringing his confusion into the relationship instead of outside of it. I was having a conversation with someone about this not too long ago, actually, is a lot of times when we're in times of crisis or struggle, our natural instinct is to sort of want to clam up and withdraw, especially when it comes to talking to the Lord, because all of these things are happening around us, and oftentimes it's just overwhelming. We don't know what to do with it. But secondly, we just think of all the confusion and frustration. We think to ourselves, I can't bring this to God for whatever reason, A plus B, A, B, C, D, or whatever. But the most important part of every relationship is to keep that channel of dialogue open, because that's cultivating intimacy. That's saying, even though, Lord, I don't understand this, I'm trusting you to work it out with me, rather than saying, Lord, you're not a part of this part of my life. So in this case, what Job is doing is intimacy, because what distance does is it hides from that, whereas intimacy speaks. Even when it's messy, even when it's emotional, and when it's unresolved. I would say especially when it's unresolved and emotional. I think we talked about this way early on in the series, is, God doesn't want our polished heart, right? Or our polished piety. He wants you to bring the truth, because he can handle it. But oftentimes we think that we have to present ourselves in sort of this state of reverence, and we're always so thankful, and we're always, so full of worship and praise. But that's not always the case. Oftentimes, your grief and your sorrow, bringing that to the foot of his throne, at the foot of grace, is the offering and the praise and worship that you can offer. Because this is all I have left. I get my days mixed up. Anyways, he was talking about the poor woman who brought her, he had all these rich men who were bringing their wealth into the temple, and they were saying, oh, wow, great is me, I'm bringing all my stuff. But we had this poor little lady who brought all she had was two little coins that she had, was all that she had, and she gave everything, and Jesus said she gave more than everybody else here. The same goes in the spiritual concept, is that at times of struggle and grief and sorrow, sometimes all we have left is our sorrow. And that is the praise that is worthy, that God says, this is what I want from you. I don't want you to pretend like everything's okay. I want the truth, right? And it's just like with any relationship, if even in my own marriage with my husband, if I was struggling with something and I refuse to tell my husband what it is, and he can tell, he said, Tabby, I know something's wrong. You want to tell me what's wrong? No, I'm fine. What does that do? That cultivates, first off, distance. And then because we're not having any kind of dialogue, now resentment is building between us. Because he sees that I cannot trust him enough to bring my problems to the table. So this is the intimacy that he's offering each and every one of us, is to say that, if we take our interpersonal relationships in this life, it should be sort of that picture of intimacy that we have ultimately through God. And so if everything we're struggling in our own interpersonal relationships to have with anybody, then imagine the kind of struggle we have bringing our issues to the Lord. One of the things for me is that the Lord, with all the healing that he's done in my life, my whole life was predicated on distrusting of people because of everything that's happened. But I'm not going to go into it today, but everything is cultivated in me a personality in which I just approached every relationship with distrust. And what that did was it caused distance with everybody that I knew. And so my idea of God then was at a distance, right? I can present my problems, and I have to present myself a certain way before I even approach him, right? So already I'm cultivating this idea of God that is completely misaligned to who he is. But when the Lord brought healing to my life, he systematically broke everything down that I thought I knew about the world. And he says, we're going to rebuild you from the foundation up, from a new foundation from me. And so now every relationship that I approach is from the baseline standard of what God has established in me through trust. He's the one that established the standard for me of what trust even looks like. So naturally, that branches out to every relationship that I encounter now in my life, which is amazing. Have you met me 5 years ago? Completely different, like night and day. And that is a testimony that I will scream all day long of the power of what God can do. I think that's why if my purpose in this life is to help people cultivate intimacy with a relationship with God, then I will scream it at the top of my lungs, because he has done such profound change in my life. And I want each and every one of us, anyone who I come in contact with, to be able to understand that what God wants with each and every one of us is intimacy and not distance. And Job is the perfect picture of what intimacy looks like, because it is so messy, right? And for someone like me 5 years ago, I didn't like Job, because it was a completely foreign concept to me. But now that the Lord actually used his story, of Job's story, to bring the most amazing healing in my life. And I think is it James 1:5 or 5:1? I can't remember. It's James 1, I think. But it talks about confess your faults one to another so that you may be healed. Is it James 5:1? Anyways, but the principle behind that is, when we hold things in, what does it naturally do is it cultivates shame, right? And so the longer time grows, the more shame is built around that. And so what you're doing is now you're building this wall around yourself, and it's weighing you under the burden that you have created because you're withholding that. So when he talks about confessing your faults to one to another, what it's basically doing is you're speaking that out loud, basically releasing the power of that shame that you are beholden to. And so that shame can no longer hold you under its bondage. And that those around you then can come to you and help lift you up from that place. And what does that do too? Is it also then presents a testimony of God, the Holy Spirit's work in you. And this is why we should never conceal what the Lord is doing in your life, because your testimony is meant as a witness and a testimony of the power of the Holy Spirit that's working in each and every one of us. This is why we should be encouraged to speak freely about what the Lord is actively doing in your life. It's not only to encourage one another and for those who are going through struggles as well, but to present the witness of what God has done in his character and his power and sovereignty and in his love through each and every one of us. So even if we think our testimony is so small and minuscule, that's not true at all, because you're speaking to the power of God over your life, right? But so anyways, going back to what Job was talking about. So here in verse 2, he's talking to the Lord. He says, Lord, why do you contend against me? So here he's not asking for explanation. He's asking, why does it feel like you are against me? Again, this is very deeply relational language that he's using. So at this point, Job is not trying to prove something. Basically, he's trying to understand how to stand before the God that he knows. But that's just it, right? So intimacy with God, it doesn't eliminate the hard questions. Rather, I think it gives you a place to where you can bring them. Like, that's true intimacy. So silence is not always reverence. We think that we shouldn't say some things to the Lord, but rather sometimes honesty, I think, is the greatest act of trust that you can bring, just like you're saying. How much do you trust the Lord enough to bring everything, including the parts that you're ashamed of yourself, to him, right? Especially those parts. So then in verses 6 through 7, he says, you know that I am not wicked, and there is none who can deliver out of your hand. Here, Job does not accept the accusations of his friends, but rather he remains anchored in what he knows to be true, and that he's not wicked before God. And yet, even while holding on to that truth, he begins to feel the weight of what has been spoken over him by his friends. So this creates a deep internal tension for Job, in that he's not agreeing that he's guilty, but his experience is beginning to feel as though he is being treated as if he were. So what he knows to be true about himself before God is now colliding with what life seems to be saying. And then layered into this then is the reality of God's sovereignty. So Job acknowledges that that no one can deliver him out of God's hand, and there is no higher court to appeal to. There's no escape from the one who governs all things. So if this suffering is within God's hand, then the question becomes even more pressing, in which we should ask, why does it feel like condemnation when God himself knows that I am not wicked? So this is not simply confusion that Job is wrestling with, it's relational disorientation. Everything he knows about God is now being challenged, and he's left in like a tailspin. He doesn't even know what to think anymore. But he's clinging on to what he does know. And I think this is what we were talking about a couple weeks back, is like, how the book of Job is constantly inviting us to look at that dual perspective. And that even though Job doesn't know what is happening and he's struggling to understand what's happening, he's still choosing God's perspective over his own, even in that anguish. And this is him wrestling to choose that perspective over his own. You can know the truth about yourself before God and still feel condemned under pressure. This is often kind of what happens when we're going through these moments of tension in our life. And I think what's happening in this chapter is very important, is the core of this chapter would actually be the identity crisis that Job is going through. And I mean the spiritual identity crisis. So, because right now he's caught between two different realities that he cannot seem to reconcile. So number one, he knows that God is just, and he also knows I'm not wicked, yet I'm suffering like I am wicked. So here his entire framework for understanding how the world works begins to collapse. So here's where the crisis deepens for him. Then in verse 15 he says, even if I am righteous, I cannot lift my head. It's important though that he's not saying, remember, he's not saying because of any wickedness or sin or iniquity that he's done. So it's not moral guilt that he's feeling right now. Rather, it's the language of his own identity unraveling before not only his friends, himself, but especially before God. In the ancient world, actually, to lift one's head was to stand in like dignity and to know one's place, to exist with clarity, essentially. But here Job is saying that even if he were declared righteous, he no longer knows how to stand as himself. So he's not collapsing, like we were talking about, into sin consciousness. But right now, what he's experiencing is that he's being overwhelmed by the realization that even his own righteousness cannot even give him footing before the God that he knows. This is what we're talking about in chapter 9. He's basically coming to terms with the magnitude of who God is that he worships. And in this chapter, he's speaking to God. He says, Lord, I cannot even stand or lift my head because of your magnitude. And there's this realization is so crushing to him because he realizes I don't have a mediator to even speak on my behalf. So for him, this is utter despair. Then in verses 8 through 12, he says, Lord, your hands have shaped me and made me completely, yet you destroy me. Remember, I pray, that you have made me as the clay, and would you return me to dust? Have you not poured me out as milk and curdled me like cheese? You have clothed me with skin and flesh and have knit me together with bone and sinew. You have granted me life and loyal love, and your care has preserved my spirit. We were talking about this a couple weeks ago, is that two people can say the same thing and mean two completely different things, right? What he's saying here in verses 8 through 12 actually mirrors what we see in Psalm chapter 139, verses 13 through 16. In that verse, it says, for you have formed my inward parts. You knitted me together in my mother's womb. I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. My frame was not hidden from you when I was being made in secret. Then in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 5, it says, before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you. So the shift here that we see is that these truths that Job is speaking is not comforting him, rather it's confusing him. He cannot reconcile. He says, Lord, you've made me, you've knitted me, you took so much care and detail into making me just to die like this, right? This is his state of mind. And who can blame him? I don't blame him. Because notice that he never asks God why all these specific things happen to him. This isn't a physical crisis that he's going through. This is why it goes much deeper than the outer layers. This is attacking him in his innermost spirit. It's a spiritual crisis he's going through. So everything that he's speaking from is from the spiritual confusion that he's going through. And this is why, he doesn't even bring up those things, because those things don't even matter. They do matter, but they don't matter to the extent that his anguish is crying out right now. So Job is using the same language of creation that elsewhere leads to worship, right? Just like Psalm 139 and Jeremiah, those are worship. But here, in his suffering, it's leading him to question everything. So the truth doesn't change for him, but rather his experience has changed for him. What's happening here is Job he's trying to understand from within his limited framework. But what the book is also inviting us to do is to look at it from God's perspective, in which God is actively refining him. Because remember, I think it was 2 weeks ago, Job was basically saying, Lord, you have turned your arrows against me and they pierced me, right? But in Isaiah, God talks about his servant as being the arrow that he's refining into the sharp arrow that he hides in his quiver. So Job sees it as a form of torment, but God sees it as him refining the servant into the role that he specifically created them for. So what Job is experiencing now is confusion, loss, and contradiction. But what's happening on the spiritual aspect of it, from the heavenly perspective, is that God is actively dismantling Job's shallow understanding. And he's also deepening the relational foundation that Job once had. So we talked about a little while ago, oftentimes struggle and strife and grief will pull away the curtain to reveal where our foundation is truly rooted in, right? And in this case, Job's foundation is rooted in God, but it's very limited in the understanding of God. And God is systematically pulling away parts of Job's foundation so that he can see first and foremost what's there, so that God can rebuild it when he speaks again in the whirlwind. Because oftentimes when it comes to healing in our lives, we just want the end result, right? But the most painful part about it is the systematic peeling away of the former self so that God can reveal, he's like chipping away the parts of the heart of stone so that he can reveal the flesh and blood beneath it. He cannot bring healing if we're still encapsulated in that stone, right? And it's a very painful process. And this is what I think is happening to Job, is that he doesn't understand what's happening, but the Lord, what this whole matter is taking place, is God is systematically removing the scaffolding that he once held so tightly to, so that God can rebuild him from the ground up again. Does that make sense? And the Bible often uses this metaphor of pruning, right? This the idea of pruning. It's meant to remove the excess growth, and it also forces the root system to go deeper. So oftentimes when you have a new plant, if you plant it in the ground, what'll happen is if you just let it grow wild, it'll go nice and like crazy and stuff, and you'll have all these wild shoots, and you think, wow, my plant is doing so great. But what happens if you do a little bit tug, you might actually be able to rip it up a lot easier than it should. But what pruning does on the early stages, you're basically cutting off all those wild shoots to first off let the main core branches get the sunlight and the air that it needs to. But what it's also doing is it's forcing the plant's energy to drive its roots further into the ground to receive more nutrients, so that it can later grow. And like it kind of talks, I think they talk about kind of having that full bloom moment. It may start off like a little peewee plant for a little while, and you're like, man, my plant's not doing so great. What we don't see is what's happening in the root system, and then eventually it kind of explodes, right? And that's what I think the Bible is talking about when it talks about that pruning process, is that it's not that the Lord's cutting bad things away from us, but rather things that are unnecessary that we're putting all of our energy into that we shouldn't be. Rather, if he's the root system, then we should be forcing our energy and roots into him, for him to cultivate and to water. In Hebrews chapter 12, verses 10 and 11, it says, he disciplines us for our good, that we may share his holiness. For the moment, all discipline seems painful, but later it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. So pruning in Scripture isn't about cutting off something because it's bad, but it's removing what's unnecessary, like we were talking about. But, obviously Job doesn't see this as pruning. He's not going through this and he's like, oh man, thank you, Lord, for all this that's happening, right? He doesn't see it that way. And I want to make sure that I honor his experience here, because, he's in the throes of it right now. But God may also be deepening what we only understood at the surface level through our struggles. So what once grew outward is now being driven inward for Job. And spiritually, for us, this means that what feels like loss may actually be the stripping away of everything that cannot sustain him, so that his faith is no longer rooted in understanding alone, but in God himself. This is where we were talking about a while ago. It's like we have a theoretical understanding of God in our relationship, but right now God is cultivating a practical understanding of who he is. So in this chapter, the real conflict here is not Job's friends. Actually, the conflict that Job is dealing with is God's vastness. So he's no longer fighting his friends. He's facing the vastness of the God he worships. And like we were saying, it's crushing him because he realizes he doesn't have a mediator to even stand between them. But here his friends, they basically represent a limited system of understanding versus God, who represents the infinite reality. And when you're facing infinite reality, often it's too much of a mental overload. How can you fathom such greatness? So his friends, in this case, they're explainable, they're very structured and predictable and controllable. This is human understanding. But when he's faced with trying to understand God, he's coming to the realization that God is uncontainable, that he's not fully explainable, and he's not governed by human logic. So the real issue then becomes of whether or not Job will retreat to a system that he can understand or remain before a God that he cannot. And this is the tension that we also face too, each and every one of us. A lot of times we want to understand or we want the answers because having the answers in some form or fashion gives us a sense of control over our situation. But are we willing to trust and lean on a God who doesn't always provide the answers when we want them? This is why I think it's the real tension. It's like because it's so much easier to retreat to what we know and to the systems rather than standing in the unknown. You know, like the idea of being unmoored in this ocean, this storm that's raging. We have no lifeline. We feel like we have no lifeline, And so our natural instinct is to say, well, I can swim somewhere that's safer, something that I know, right? But a lot of times what the Lord is inviting us to is to remain in that uncertainty, because that's where he's inviting, just like with John in the boat, when Jesus was walking out to them in the boat. Not John, Peter, excuse me. And Peter wanted so badly to go to Jesus, and Jesus said, come, right? But the thing is, Jesus was standing in the middle of the storm, and he's inviting us, each and every one of us, out of the boat into that. And the boat is our certainty, even though it's like about on the brink of like being just crushed by the waves. But right at the moment, it feels like the safest option for us, right? And I think this is the tension, right? Is that we're having to make that choice of whether or not we're willing to trust the Lord in our uncertainty or go back to the systems that we think we know. And it's just like you were saying, the Lord's not going to force you out of the boat, but he will. I truly believe that even if you were like, I'm not going to leave the boat, I'm going to stay. If it crashes, he's going to wait for you, and he's still going to come, But he's going to be like, now we're going to have to work things out a little bit harder, you know what I mean? So, yeah. That's definitely going to be more of a process in that, but it's so easy when you're outside of the situation to look at somebody else and say, well, you know what, why didn't you just make the decision and come out? Why didn't you just do this or that? Everybody else can say that all day long, just like Job's friends are saying. But the truth is that oftentimes the situation we're in, even if it's years long situation, it's become so, human beings, we're naturally inclined to seek consistency, even if that consistency is hurting us. So it may be a prison for us, but in many cases, for many people, it's a very comfortable prison. Because any idea of a life outside of this life that I'm living now is too uncertain for me. It's too much chaos. I cannot stand it. So many people will spend most, if not all, their life living in a circumstance that is only tearing them down. Many Christians especially. And that's why the idea of clinging to Jesus becomes this act that is so bold and courageous. We just don't give enough credit for, we say, That's why Jesus speaks so much of a person's faithfulness. He says, wow, such great faith you have. We're trusting in someone, in a God that is outside of our circumstances to be able to carry us out of something that we have no idea where it's going to lead us. What great faithfulness, you know? But this, I think, this whole chapter goes back to the idea of what Beth was talking about last week when she was bringing up the Beatitudes, right? The idea of being poor in spirit. And we can find that in Matthew chapter 5, verse 3. Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of God." This is where I think where the awareness of total dependence comes from, and the inability to justify oneself and our need for God alone. When I was younger, I used to think of that phrase, poor in spirit, meant that I had to be poor, right? You know, I think literally, but Jesus is talking about the spiritual bankruptcy that we need to confront within ourselves, and that there is nothing we can bring to the throne of God in terms of saving ourselves. When we come to this realization, just as Job is coming to now here in chapter 10, Job realizes the vastness of God. And he says, even if I were declared righteous, I could not even lift my head in your presence because your righteousness is too great to stand before. This is the poor in spirit that is being displayed through Job's story. And this is what I think that every believer comes to that place. Every person who becomes a believer especially, but we as believers, we go through this over and over again throughout our lives. It's like the sanctification process. But the initial coming to the Lord is that idea that we must be spiritually bankrupt of any righteousness that I can offer the Lord to rescue me. Meaning that I have to rely completely on Him and Him alone through faith. So in chapter 10, Job, he realizes he cannot defend himself and he cannot reconcile his own reality. And in chapter 9, Job says, I cannot answer him, speaking about God. Then in chapter 10, he says, I cannot even lift my head. And in chapter 9 again, he says, there is no mediator for us. So this is not showing weakness, but the inability and spiritual bankruptcy that each and every one of us should have before God. This is the posture that we should bring. So often we come presenting ourselves with a posture that we have something to offer the Lord. But we have really nothing because He is the one that offers it all. So here Job embodies what it means to be poor in spirit before the fullness of revelation that God will later give him in the later chapters through the whirlwind. So Job does not primarily fear punishment for sin. Compared to the vastness of God, the power of sin has lost its power compared to the vastness of God in this situation. It's not that...
Wow, that's...
Sorry?
Just to think of it the way you said that. What did you say? Sin has lost its...
Yeah, sin has effectively lost its power in comparison to the vastness of God. Let's think about power over our life. This is where I think that we often become enslaved to sin. It's because we give it the power to enslave us. But when we look at the power and the vastness of God, we say, Lord, I cannot even stand before you. Therefore, sin now facing God means nothing to me in lieu of what I'm presented for before the power of God. His power is too much. I don't even care about sin right now because right now I'm facing total destitution of righteousness, spiritual righteousness before the one who is righteous. So it's like when we receive His righteousness, when we receive salvation, this is why the idea as believers is that we are no longer enslaved, held bondage to sin, because we are now bondservants of God, of Jesus Christ, and it is His righteousness that overcomes all power and everything else. This is why the idea that we have to change our mindset every day. This is a daily process, right? Is we have to realize that who am I? I have to make an active decision in my life. Who am I going to give power to today? So here basically, Job, he doesn't fear the punishment of sin. This is why his friends are trying to bring up, this is your wickedness, this is your sin, you've done something wrong. But he's saying, no, none of that matters now because God is too big for me to even lift my head. This is Job's crisis right now. So true reverence is not the fear of consequences, right? I don't need the fear of hellfire and brimstone to bring me before the throne of grace. But what Job is presenting is that rather what we need is awe before God, before who God is, and because being poor in spirit means that it's not being crushed by failure, it's being undone by God's magnitude. To be poor in spirit is to realize that even your best cannot sustain you before God, and that you have nothing left to stand on except for Him and Him alone. So when Jesus says in Matthew, He says, blessed, throughout with the Beatitudes, it reframes what we are seeing here in Job. So what appears on the surface to be collapse is actually the beginning of true spiritual posture. Job is not simply falling apart, he's being brought to the end of self-reliance. And in that place, what he is gaining is something deeper, which is a posture of complete dependence on God. But so Job, he knows God, he trusts God, but he cannot reconcile his experience against the God that he knows. Many, if not most, all of us will go through this at some point in our life. But just like you were saying, Sherry, he's not abandoning God. He's clinging on to Him with every ounce of strength that he has left. And the thing is that he's losing his ability to understand himself before God. This is why I'm saying I think the core of this chapter is Job's own identity, spiritual identity. This is the crisis moment for him. Because basically, he's losing his own framework for understanding himself before God. So even though Job is rejecting his friend's own framework, that doesn't negate Job's own personal framework for understanding God. We all, whether we like to admit it or not, we all have our own framework for how we understand God. But what's happening here is that God is systematically dismantling Job's own understanding so that later on in the whirlwind, God can reveal Himself entirely to Job. Like we were talking about earlier, God cannot fully reveal Himself if we're still encapsulated in the parts of ourselves of stone that's blocking us from even seeing the true revelation of who He is. And this is what I think the Lord did for me, is that everything that I had, built my life around, the Lord had to tear all of that down. It was a very bad foundation. And the Lord had to tear it down so that He can rebuild the house on a good foundation, on Him, the rock. He is the rock, right? But we can't build a very nice house on a foundation that's rotting underneath it. And this is what the Lord is doing, I think, in Job's case. It's not to say that Job isn't saved, right? Because God has already declared him righteous. So I'm saying the things that Job is experiencing is not because he's done something bad, but rather his own understanding and framework is still misaligned to who God truly is. And this is why this whole system, this whole story is unfolding the way it is because Job's own understanding is being challenged about what he knows about God. So here it's not a crisis of faith, it's a crisis of identity before the reality of who God is. And right now Job is left in a place where he cannot explain God, but he also can't leave Him. So when your understanding of God no longer explains your reality, do you retreat into what feels safe? Or do you wrestle honestly with Him? Because at the end of the day, if you're willing to wrestle with God, it's going to cost you a lot. It costs us clarity, comfort, and control. But also, staying means remaining in the tension without immediate answers as well. We can stay in the simulated reality that we think is true, or we're willing to trust the Lord in revealing the true reality.
All right, I think this is where we'll close for the day. I do hope this study blessed you and encouraged you to dive deeper into the Word this week. But until next time, I'm Tabitha, and this has been Hidden Thread.